In 1991, a movie called Silence of the Lambs introduced audiences to a scene that felt almost too strange to be real. An FBI agent named Clarice Starling sits across a thick glass wall from a man in a maximum security cell. He is as brilliant as he's dangerous, and she needs his help, because the only person capable of thinking like the animal she's chasing is an animal himself. Hannibal Lecter became one of the most iconic characters in movie history. What Thomas Harris, who wrote the original novels, has acknowledged in interviews is that the concept wasn't invented for fiction. It was already happening. 7 years before the movie came out, in the winter of 1984, detectives from the King County Sheriff's Office in Washington State drove to a prison in Florida. They were carrying case files from one of the most troubling open investigations in the country. Dozens of women found near a river south of Seattle. A killer they couldn't identify, and a task force that had run out of places to look. The man they went to see was Ted Bundy. Convicted, on death row, and it turned out willing to talk. What happened in that room, and what Bundy told those detectives, didn't just move the Green River investigation forward. It helped establish a model for how law enforcement thinks about violent offenders to this day. This is the story of that visit, of the two men at the center of it, and of the uncomfortable reality that the most useful guide to understanding a predator is sometimes another predator. Gary Leon Ridgway was not the kind of man you'd write a thriller about. He was born in Salt Lake City in 1949, raised in a working-class area south of Seattle. He struggled in school. Diagnosed with dyslexia, held back multiple times, and a recorded IQ in the low 80s. He graduated, joined the Navy, served in Vietnam, and then he came home and got a job painting trucks on an assembly line at the Kenworth factory in Renton, Washington. And he kept that job for nearly 30 years. He married 3 times. He went to church regularly, not occasionally, not as a social habit, but genuinely and consistently. He read the Bible aloud at work. He cried during sermons. He went door to door in his neighborhood to share his faith. His coworkers described him as sincere about it. He was not magnetic. He was not memorable. When investigators asked people who had known Ridgway for years to describe him, the word that came up the most was normal. Quiet. A bit awkward, and just fine. Between 1982 and the late 1990s, Gary Ridgway is believed to have taken the lives of more than 70 women. When he was finally arrested and questioned, he told detectives he had lost count. The cases began in the summer of 1982. 5 women were found near the Green River in a matter of weeks, then more. The victims were mostly women working in street-based sex work and young women living on the streets along the highway corridor south of Seattle. They had a clear pattern and no viable suspect. In 1984, they interviewed Gary Ridgway. He took a polygraph. He passed, so they set him aside. He kept going to work, kept going to church, and he kept killing. So the task force, running low on options, got on a plane to Florida. Ted Bundy was by 1984 one of the most studied criminal cases in American history. He had confessed to, or been convicted of, killing more than 30 women across multiple states throughout the 1970s. He was educated, articulate, and has spent years watching investigators try to understand people like him. He agreed to speak with the King County Task Force. And what he told them was precise. The Green River Killer, Bundy said, was almost certainly returning to the locations where he had left his victims, not for sentimental reasons, but for practical ones. He told detectives to stake out those sites. He described the likely profile in terms that were, in hindsight, accurate in almost every detail. The killer would appear stable and employed. He would not look like what he was. He would be embedded in a community, have a routine, seem like the people around him, like someone ordinary. He would be someone you'd pass on the street without a second thought. Bundy was describing Gary Ridgway. He didn't know that, but he was describing him. The task force followed Bundy's advice and conducted surveillance at known disposal sites. They did, in fact, observe Ridgway returning to one of those locations, but at the time, evidence wasn't enough to pursue. What Bundy had given them was accurate, but the technology and resources available to act on it weren't yet sufficient. It would take another 17 years. What makes the Bundy consultation remarkable, it's not that it solved the case in 1984. It didn't. What makes it remarkable is what it represented. The recognition that understanding how a particular kind of person thinks requires more than academic theory. It requires someone who has been there. And Bundy was not the only one. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, two FBI agents named Robert Ressler and John Douglas began a project that most of their colleagues thought was either groundbreaking or a waste of resources, depending on who you asked. They started interviewing killers in prison, not to reopen cases, not to gather confessions, but to understand. Systematically, on record, how these individuals thought, selected victims, justify what they did to themselves, and how they managed to live undetected in ordinary communities. These interviews became the foundation of the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, and they became the foundation of modern criminal profiling. Among the people they interviewed was Edmund Kemper. Ed Kemper isn't a name that comes with the same cultural recognition as Bundy. But within law enforcement and forensic psychology circles, he is considered one of the most significant interview subjects in the history of the field. Kemper was convicted of multiple killings in California in the early 1970s, had a high measured intelligence and an unusual willingness to articulate, in clinical detail, the internal logic of what he had done. He told the FBI agents where their profiling assumptions were wrong. He corrected them. He explained in practical terms how someone like him managed to appear unremarkable to the outside world. Some of what Kemper shared in those sessions about how offenders chose their victims, how they manage risk, how they maintain a normal seeming life, became standard training material within the FBI. The Netflix series Mindhunter dramatized his interviews, and while it took some creative liberties, the core premise is accurate. The agents were genuinely learning from these people they were interviewing, and those conversations changed how law enforcement approaches this category of crime. The Bundy consultation with King County detectives fits within this same framework. It wasn't a unique event. It was part of a broader, evolving understanding within law enforcement that the most actionable intelligence about how a certain type of offender operates often comes from offenders who have already been caught. Uncomfortable, documented, but effective. The question that follows naturally from all of this is the one that most people ask when they first encounter cases like Gary Ridgway's. How does nobody notice? The short answer is that human beings aren't naturally equipped to identify this kind of person. And the reason for that is, at its core, a feature rather than a flaw. Most of us extend baseline trust to the people around us. We use visible behavior, consistency, routines, politeness, and community involvement as a proxy for character. When someone shows up to work every day, raises children, goes to church, responds normally in conversations, we integrate those signals into a general picture of who they are. We do not walk around treating every unremarkable person as a potential threat, because if we did, a functional society would be impossible. The people who most successfully exploit this are the ones who understand it, consciously or not, and maintain those visible signs with precision. Forensic psychologists refer to the external separation that allows someone to commit serious harm while maintaining a normal exterior as compartmentalizing. For most people, extreme actions create visible disturbance, anxiety, social withdrawal, changes in behavior that others can detect. For a small number of individuals, that connection is either absent or suppressible to a degree that renders it invisible from the outside. Ridgway's religious practice is a useful lens here. Investigators and psychologists who reviewed his case noted that the faith was not a mask. It was a genuine part of how he experienced his life. The absence of internal conflict between those two realities was not a performance. It was, in its way, the thing that made him so difficult to see. The FBI's profiling work, built partly on those early interviews, was an attempt to get ahead of this problem, to identify behavioral patterns and social markers that might surface earlier in an investigation, before decades pass. It has led to real advances. But it hasn't solved the problem, because the gap between understanding something in theory and detecting it in a specific individual in real time, in a community of thousands of ordinary people, remains very wide and very difficult. But here's a question I have that doesn't get asked often enough in conversations about this topic. The peak of documented serial offendings in the United States, by all measures, was the 1970s and 1980s. The Green River killings, Bundy, Kemper, John Wayne Gacy, BTK. Nearly all the cases that defined public understanding of this category of crime belong to roughly the same 20-year window. Since then, confirmed cases have declined significantly. So what happened? I believe the most straightforward explanation is technology. DNA profiling, which wasn't usable in criminal investigations until the late 1980s, fundamentally changed the risk calculation. A single piece of biological evidence preserved from a scene or a victim can now be connected to a suspect to a crime decades later. Gary Ridgway was caught because of DNA collected in 1982 that couldn't possibly be processed until 2001. Surveillance cameras now cover public places, transit systems, car parks, and commercial areas to a degree that would have been unimaginable in 1984. Cell phones generate location data continuously. Forensic databases have grown substantially. The practical difficulty of moving through the world without leaving an untraceable record has increased enormously. There are also changes to how missing persons cases are handled. Following sustained advocacy from families, many of them families of victims whose cases weren't treated with sufficient urgency, protocols in many jurisdictions have shifted. The gap in response between cases that historically received fast, intensive attention and those that didn't has narrowed, though it has not closed. But some criminologists raise a different question. Not whether serial offending has declined, but whether detection has simply become harder. Whether the cases that do occur are longer interval, lower frequency, and more geographically dispersed, and therefore harder to link. Whether the profile is shifted towards methods that look on surface like something other than what they are. The honest answer is, we don't fully know. Cold case units regularly re-examine deaths that were initially attributed to accidents and other causes to find grounds for further investigation. Some of those cases turn out to be connected. The number of officially confirmed active serial killer cases at any given time is low. Whether that reflects a genuine decline or a detection gap is a question criminologists continue to work on. What we do know is that the tools now available to investigators, the DNA databases, the surveillance infrastructure, the profiling frameworks built on those early FBI interviews, the precedent set by consultations like the one in that Florida prison in 1984 are substantially better than anything that existed when Gary Ridgway began. Whether that's enough, and how much we don't see, is something no one can answer with certainty. Ted Bundy was executed in Florida in January of 1989, 5 years after his conversations with the King County Task Force. Gary Ridgway was arrested in 2001. He pleaded guilty to 49 counts of aggravated murder, and he is currently serving life without parole in Washington state. He is 76 years old. The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, built on the framework those early interviews established, continues to operate. The prolific discipline Ressler and Douglas and others developed from those conversations, from sitting across people like Bundy and Kemper and asking uncomfortable questions and listening carefully to the answers, is now a standard practice in major investigations worldwide. The Hannibal Lecter films are fiction. The consultations they were inspired by were not. And the thing that made those consultations work, the willingness to engage seriously with a difficult question rather than look away from it, is the same thing that has driven every meaningful advance in how we understand and investigate this category of crime. The devil, it turns out, does know his own. Whether we're willing to listen, it's a different question entirely. Thank you for listening. Until the next one. Good night.